Group of bright samurai bureaucrats. They started from scratch with the task of building a whole nation.
These are young men who essentially usurp their position. They control the seals of the Emperor Meiji and therefore are able to issue orders in his name.
Once they are there, and they have a new capital, and they have an emperor who's only 16 years old, he's not someone that they can do too much with, he doesn't know how to ride a horse, but they, in the name of the emperor, begin to think of their new government. And from 1868 to 1873, a transformation takes place that no one had envisaged in that form. And the first few years were very uncertain.
The Meiji leaders faced a nation in chaos. The countryside erupted in spontaneous outbreaks of hysteria. Only a year before the restoration, thousands of people had danced into Edo, tossing banknotes in the air and yelling, "Ejanaika, Ejanaika," meaning, who cares, or what the hell. It was a bizarre reaction by Japan's common folk to the confusion in the country. To bring order to anarchy was the key challenge to the Meiji bureaucrats.
Well, these young samurai, Ito, Saigo, Okubo, really had to start building the whole administration. They had to have a finance ministry, a tax policy, a defense policy. They had to have an agriculture policy. They were starting from scratch and working out by themselves the mechanism of government for a huge country.
What happened was that all of these reforms, which were highly forward-looking in terms of 19th century politics and society, were made in Tokyo on paper. That is to say, they were proclaimed, let there be compulsory education. And you, the villagers, will pay for it. Let there be a national army. You, the villagers, will run the draft system.
Farmers were outraged by higher tariffs and what they called the blood tax. Government officials taking their sons off the land to serve in the army. Their fury exploded in spontaneous rebellions across the country, challenging the program of the Meiji leaders.
People were very upset, very disturbed. They could solve the farmers' problem rather easily. You could cut taxes and keep that sector happy. But there was a wider problem beyond that. How are they going to give everybody in this country a sense of participation, a sense of citizenship, a sense that they were part of the reform movement?
The first hardest thing they had to do was to destroy their own class. They had to destroy the samurai who had lived a privileged existence for hundreds of years as a non-productive class. The Meiji oligarchs suspended their stipends in rice and ultimately compelled the samurai to go into business for themselves.
Many samurai couldn't make the transition. Poor and unemployed, they bitterly resented their loss of privilege. General Saigo, who'd led the army that toppled the shogun, wanted to preserve the samurai class. He argued for a plan to employ samurai by invading Korea. When Meiji's more cautious leaders overruled him, he left the government. When they abolished samurai stipends, Saigo went to war against the government he'd helped to establish. The Satsuma Rebellion marked the last stand of the way of the samurai. In the greatest battle, Saigo's colorful samurai laid siege to Kumamoto Castle. It was guarded by a new Meiji invention, uniformed conscript soldiers. Saigo called them dirt farmers, but now they had the right to bear arms. As the war raged on, Saigo's forces dwindled to a few hundred men. Saigo beat a bitter retreat to his home in Kagoshima, where, in true samurai fashion, he committed seppuku, ritual suicide. Saigo's death was the death of the samurai class. It also marked the true beginning of the Meiji transformation. The new era had a new slogan, Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment. It meant, in a superficial way, a love of all things Western, from beer to bustles to beef. It also meant something more profound, a new sense that with the samurai gone, all would be equal under the rule of the emperor.
I think this may sound a little bit paradoxical, but the restoration of the absolute power itself enabled the democratization of Japan, because with the single absolutely powerful power at the top, the rest came more or less the same.
Equality of opportunity meant everyone suddenly had an incentive to improve their own lives by modernizing Japan. Such was the notion of Fukuzawa Yukichi. Fukuzawa had traveled overseas, and he, more than any other, popularized Western ideas. His first book, which described his travels in the West, was a runaway bestseller, teaching Japanese how to eat and dress Western style. Fukuzawa was fascinated by Western timekeeping. To a country that still kept time by the sun, the clock was a powerful symbol of modernization. His later books brought European and American ideas into Japanese homes. Fukuzawa became a kind of prophet for Meiji's modern age.
So Fukuzawa became a national hero. He's still a national hero. I mean, Fukuzawa is on the Japanese currency. He is the national representative of the spirit of Meiji in its early commitment to progress on the national level and success on the individual level.
Fukuzawa inspired a generation of youth with a slogan that propelled Japan's progress. Heaven, he said, creates no man above or below another man. Samurai were ordered to hand in their swords and have their topknots cut off. Japan's last shogun voluntarily submitted to a new barber and wardrobe. Throughout the land, haircutting became big business, and Fukuzawa himself was eagerly transformed from samurai to gentleman. A popular song of the period rang out, "If you slap a barbered head, it sounds back civilization and enlightenment." At first, progress meant aping all things Western. Some Japanese wanted to abolish the Japanese language in favor of English. Others proposed intermarriage with Westerners as a way of improving Japan's racial stock. To many citizens, this era meant the beginning of electricity. But it was the explosion of wheels in Japan that truly marked the Meiji transformation. The invention of the rickshaw was as momentous in Japan as the coming of the Model T Ford 40 years later. Then came the horse-drawn trolleys, and after that, perhaps the most important of all Meiji machines, the train. The great symbol of Japan's modernization. In Tokyo, Western fashions were the rage. High society quickly learned the latest steps, and Japan's first ministers became known as the dancing cabinet for the fancy dress balls they hosted for foreign dignitaries. Foreign cartoonists savagely mocked the strivings of the Japanese, and the Japanese struck back at the West in new satirical magazines. While the dancing cabinet whirled to Strauss waltzes in Tokyo, the Japanese countryside remained worlds apart from the changes going on in the city. For many farmers, daily life was bitter and hard. They worked with the knowledge that the countryside was paying for progress in the cities, the fancy dress balls, the splendid new government buildings.
Essentially, the story of Japan's modernization in the early Meiji period is really the story of provincial Japan. The government depended on the farmers for their product. They depended on land tax for government revenues, and the farmers were constantly exhorted by the government to buy less and grow more. As one Meiji official said, directly to the farmers he was speaking, the farmers are the fertilizer of the nation.
Farmers endured the abuse of government officials because they now owned their own land. If they worked hard, they reaped the fruits of their labor, and the nation progressed. So when the government needed schools, the farmers built them, and education became the cornerstone of Japan's modernization.
Education is the key to success, was the government's formulation, and improving oneself also served the nation. Even though they had to pay for that education, they knew that their children would get ahead, and the children knew that by their getting ahead, the family's honor would be blessed. So that the Japanese really saw education as a route to personal betterment and a way to even out and equalize and open opportunity to everybody.
As opportunity increased, so did expectations. Those who worked and paid for the nation wanted a say in the way it was run. A conflict was building between the small group of Meiji leaders and those who wanted democracy and a constitution. "50 miles from Tokyo, in a small mountain village, lies a key clue to understanding Japan's modernization. Professor Daikichi Irokawa thinks some farmers worked hard because for the first time they believed they could have a say in running the country. Irokawa's proof is an old village storehouse stuffed with the dreams of the new middle class. Inside this storehouse, Irokawa discovered something that demolished the accepted version of Japanese history. It was a people's constitution, written by a group of middle-class farmers. It proved for the first time that modern Japan was not invented by a few samurai. In early Meiji, people all over Japan were thinking about how to build a new nation.
This attic was covered with about 200 books, from this shelf to this shelf. Books you wouldn't expect to find in a 19th century Japanese farmhouse. Rousseau's The Social Contract, and books by Spencer, Locke, and John Stuart Mill. Of course, there were Chinese and Japanese books as well. Up here on this shelf, I found the Constitution, wrapped up in a Japanese handkerchief. Nobody had imagined anything like this existed. And who wrote this draft? About 30 young men of the village. They were farmers, mostly in their 20s and